Ma'am, get out of this room right now before you compromise a classified operation. The young lieutenant's voice cracked across the command center just as another warning siren echoed through the naval base. Red emergency lights flashed against the steel walls, bathing the crowded operations room in a pulsing crimson glow while officers rushed between radar stations carrying folders, headsets, and half-finished reports. Somewhere beyond the reinforced windows, rain hammered the harbor in heavy sheets, turning the Atlantic outside into a dark blur of waves and lightning. In the middle of the chaos stood a woman in a plain gray sweater holding a folded paper map against her chest. Claire Whitmore didn't move. She simply looked toward the massive digital screen mounted across the far wall where several blue naval markers were drifting dangerously close to a narrow shipping corridor. Her expression remained calm despite the panic surrounding her. She looked nothing like the officers sprinting through the command center. No uniform. No visible rank. No security escort. Just dark jeans, wet boots, and rainwater still dripping from the ends of her blonde hair onto the polished floor. The lieutenant stepped closer, clearly irritated now. "Did you hear me?" he snapped. "This room is restricted to authorized personnel only." Several officers glanced up briefly before returning to their stations. Nobody paid much attention to the civilian woman standing near the center table. At first glance, Claire looked completely out of place inside one of the most secure naval facilities on the East Coast. A commander near the radar station muttered under his breath, "How the hell did she even get in here?" Another officer gave a tired laugh while adjusting his headset. "Probably another analyst from D.C. They keep sending people who've never seen the ocean trying to tell us how to run a fleet." Claire ignored the comments. Her eyes stayed fixed on the moving coordinates. One of the destroyers had shifted 12 miles east in the last 7 minutes. Too far. Too exposed. She slowly unfolded the paper map in her hands across the nearest steel table. The edges were worn soft from years of use, marked with faded handwritten notes and precise red circles that looked older than half the officers in the room. The lieutenant immediately grabbed the corner of the map. "You can't put classified material here without clearance." Claire finally looked at him. Her voice was quiet, controlled, almost unnervingly steady compared to the rising tension around them. "Your fleet is moving into an ambush corridor." The lieutenant stared at her for a second before scoffing. "Excuse me?" Another alarm sounded overhead. This time louder. A communications officer turned sharply in his chair. "Sir, we just lost satellite confirmation on 2 patrol vessels near Sector 12. The room instantly became louder. Radios crackled. Officers started talking over one another. Someone shouted for updated coordinates while another demanded confirmation from reconnaissance teams offshore. Claire reached into her coat pocket, removed a black marker, and calmly drew a thin line across the paper map. "They have less than 20 minutes before they lose visibility completely," she said. The lieutenant folded his arms, clearly done entertaining her. "Ma'am, I don't know who you think you are, but you need to leave now." Claire capped the marker slowly. Then she looked directly at the giant radar screen again as thunder rolled across the harbor outside. "If they continue north," she said quietly, "they're sailing directly into a trap." For 3 long seconds, nobody in the command center said anything. Rain continued striking the reinforced glass overlooking the harbor while radar screens flickered across the darkened room. Then the lieutenant gave a short laugh and shook his head. "An ambush corridor," he repeated. "Do you even hear yourself?" A few nearby officers smirked before returning to their stations. The tension inside the operations center was already high, and most of them clearly saw Claire as one more distraction standing between them and a rapidly escalating naval situation. Claire remained perfectly still beside the steel table, one hand resting lightly near the folded edge of the map. Her calmness only seemed to irritate the lieutenant more. "Listen carefully," he said, lowering his voice. "This is an active military coordination room. We do not have time for civilians pretending to understand fleet movement." Claire glanced toward the radar again. One blue marker blinked twice before disappearing completely. Around the room, communications officers immediately started talking over one another. "Sir, we just lost visual tracking on Archer 2. Attempting reconnect now. Negative response from outer patrol." A commander with silver hair stepped closer to the main display, rubbing his forehead in frustration. "Weather interference?" he asked. "No, sir," another officer answered nervously. "The signal drop pattern is too organized." Claire quietly reached for the black marker again and drew a second line across the map, intersecting the first at a narrow point in the shipping lane. Her handwriting was sharp and precise, the kind developed through years of repetition under pressure. The older commander noticed immediately. "Who authorized that map?" he demanded. Claire did not answer right away. Instead, she studied the changing radar data with an intensity that contrasted sharply against the panic around her. "Your destroyers are adjusting exactly the way they want them to," she said softly. "Another 6 miles north and they lose defensive visibility from the storm front." The lieutenant stepped forward again, now visibly annoyed. "That is enough." He snatched the marker from the table. "Security is already on the way." Claire finally turned fully toward him. Her expression never changed. No anger. No embarrassment. Just a level, unreadable calm that somehow made the young officer lose confidence for half a second. "You are focused on the room," she told him quietly. "You should be focused on the ocean." Before he could respond, the entire command center suddenly dimmed for one brief second as thunder shook the base outside. Several monitors flickered. One communications officer looked up sharply. "Sir, incoming emergency transmission from the Roosevelt." Every head turned toward the center speaker mounted near the ceiling. Static crackled across the room before a strained voice pushed through the interference. "Command, this is Roosevelt Actual. We are detecting unidentified movement near Sector 12. Requesting immediate route confirmation." The room instantly fell silent. Claire slowly looked down at the map. The exact location being reported was less than 2 miles from the red line she had drawn moments earlier. The older commander stared at the paper map, then at the giant digital display above them. His eyes narrowed slightly. "How did you know that position?" he asked carefully. Claire did not answer. The lieutenant folded his arms again, trying to recover control of the situation. "Lucky guess," he muttered. But his voice no longer carried the same confidence. Across the room, another officer leaned toward the commander and whispered something under his breath while pointing directly at Claire's map. The older man's expression changed almost immediately. Not fear. Recognition. Very slowly, he stepped closer to the steel table, staring at the handwritten markings as if he had seen them somewhere before. Claire noticed but said nothing. Outside, lightning flashed across the harbor, illuminating dozens of naval ships sitting beneath the storm while deep inside the operations room, the atmosphere had started to shift. The older commander stared at the handwritten markings on the paper map as though he was looking at something pulled from another lifetime. Around him, the operations center had become noticeably quieter. Officers still moved between stations and radios still crackled through the room, but the energy had shifted from irritation to uncertainty. Claire Whitmore stood beside the steel table with her hands resting calmly near the edge of the map while rain continued hammering the harbor outside. The lieutenant noticed the commander's expression and frowned. "Sir?" he asked cautiously. "You know her?" The older man did not answer immediately. His eyes stayed fixed on the sharp red lines crossing the map with impossible precision. Then he slowly looked toward Claire. "Where did you get these route calculations?" he asked in a much different tone than before. Claire glanced briefly toward the radar screen. Another blue marker blinked weakly near Sector 12. "Your fleet is being guided exactly where someone wants them," she replied. "The storm is hiding the pattern." The lieutenant gave another frustrated laugh, though this one sounded forced. "Sir, with all respect, she could have pulled those lines out of a weather report." Claire ignored him completely. One of the younger communications officers suddenly lifted a headset from one ear. "Commander," he said nervously, "Roosevelt Actual is reporting additional signal shadows off their starboard side." Several officers exchanged uneasy looks. "How many?" the older commander asked. "Unknown, sir. Their systems cannot lock clean visuals through the storm." Claire quietly reached toward the map again and tapped a point near the narrow corridor she had marked earlier. "3 vessels," she said. "Possibly 4. Spread formation. They are not trying to engage." The lieutenant folded his arms tightly. "And now you can see through storms too," he muttered. Claire finally looked directly at him. Her expression remained perfectly calm, but something in her eyes made the young officer stop talking. "No," she said softly. "I can recognize bait." Across the room, one of the radar specialists suddenly straightened in his chair. "Sir," he called out loudly, "new contact movement confirmed." Every screen in the command center updated almost simultaneously. For faint signals had just appeared near the exact location Claire pointed to on the paper map less than 30 seconds earlier. The room froze. Nobody spoke for a moment. The lieutenant stared at the radar display, then back at Claire. His confidence visibly cracked for the first time all night. The older commander stepped closer to the table again, studying the handwriting more carefully now. "These markings," he murmured quietly. "I have seen them before." Claire said nothing. Another officer walked toward the commander carrying a digital tablet. "Sir, Intelligence Division just confirmed the route pattern matches Black Sea extraction procedures from 8 years ago." Several nearby officers immediately looked up at the mention of the operation. Even among experienced naval personnel, the Black Sea extraction had become something close to military legend. Officially, very little information about it existed. Unofficially, people still talked about the mission in low voices during late-night deployments. A trapped reconnaissance team. Hostile waters. Zero visibility. Impossible extraction window. Yet somehow the operation succeeded without losing a single sailor. The commander slowly turned toward Claire again. "That mission used handwritten navigation corrections during electronic blackout conditions," he said carefully. "Only one strategist ever designed those patterns." Claire remained silent for a few seconds while thunder rolled across the harbor outside. Then she calmly folded one corner of the weathered paper map. "Your fleet has 12 minutes before the corridor closes completely," she said. "You can keep questioning me later." Behind them, another warning alarm suddenly echoed through the command center, louder than before. The warning alarm echoed through the command center in sharp repeating bursts while every radar screen updated at once. Officers moved faster now, their earlier confidence replaced by controlled urgency. Outside the reinforced windows, rain rolled sideways across the harbor under flashes of white lightning. Deep in the center of the room, Claire Whitmore stood beside the steel table with the weathered paper map still open in front of her. Nobody was laughing anymore. The young lieutenant looked toward the older commander, clearly searching for direction. "Sir, we still do not know who she is," he said quietly. "We cannot just hand control of fleet movement to some civilian carrying a paper map." The commander did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the handwritten route corrections crossing the map in precise red lines. He had spent 28 years in naval operations and had only seen markings like those once before. During a classified briefing that most officers in the military never even knew existed. Another transmission suddenly cracked through the overhead speakers. "Command, this is Roosevelt Actual. Storm interference increasing. We are tracking multiple unidentified signatures moving parallel to our position." Static swallowed part of the message before the signal returned. "Awaiting updated navigation orders." Several officers looked toward the commander at once. One of the radar specialists shook his head nervously. "Sir, if those ships continue north another 8 miles, the storm front will block aerial support visibility." Claire calmly slid the map a few inches across the steel table. They need to pivot west now, she said. 12 degrees. The lieutenant immediately stepped forward again. Enough. His voice rose louder this time. You are not authorized to issue commands in this facility. Claire slowly looked at him. The room had become so quiet that even the hum of the overhead lights felt sharp. I am trying to keep your fleet out of a dead zone, she said evenly. You are trying to protect your pride. The words landed harder than shouting would have. Several officers glanced awkwardly toward the lieutenant while the older commander studied Claire more carefully than before. She never raised her voice. Never argued emotionally. Every sentence came measured and calm, as if she had already seen situations like this 100 times before. Another communications officer suddenly looked up from his station. Sir, he called urgently, Roosevelt Actual just confirmed visual contact with 4 vessels through the storm break. The room froze again. The commander slowly turned toward Claire. Exact formation, he asked. Claire answered without even looking at the screen. 2 staggered east. 1 trailing center. 1 hanging back to force pursuit adjustment. Silence followed. Then the radar specialist swallowed hard. That is exactly what they are seeing, sir. The lieutenant stared at Claire now with visible disbelief. How could you possibly know that? Claire rested one hand lightly against the edge of the steel table. Because the pattern is old, she replied quietly. Most people stop studying history once they survive it. The commander stepped closer. You have seen this strategy before. Claire finally met his eyes fully for the first time. I designed the countermeasure for it. Before anyone could respond, the heavy blast doors at the far end of the command center suddenly opened. Every officer in the room instinctively straightened as a tall admiral entered with 2 security personnel following several steps behind. Rainwater still clung to the shoulders of his dark uniform from outside. The moment he saw Claire standing beside the operations table, he stopped walking completely. For a brief second, the admiral simply stared at her. Then his expression changed from surprise to something much more serious. The entire command center watched in confusion as the admiral removed his gloves slowly and spoke only 4 words. Why was Commander Whitmore waiting? The command center fell completely silent after the admiral spoke. Rain pounded the harbor outside while the red emergency lights continued flashing across rows of radar screens and steel walls. Every officer in the room instinctively straightened their posture. The young lieutenant looked as though all the air had left his lungs at once. Commander, he repeated quietly, staring at Claire Whitmore in disbelief. Claire remained exactly where she was beside the steel table, one hand resting near the weathered paper map. Her expression did not change. The admiral walked forward with measured steps, his polished shoes echoing sharply against the floor. He stopped directly beside Claire and looked down at the marked coordinates crossing the map. How long ago did she warn you? He asked without looking up. Nobody answered immediately. The older commander finally cleared his throat. Approximately 9 minutes ago, sir. The admiral's jaw tightened slightly. And in those 9 minutes, he said calmly, did anyone think to ask why the woman who designed the Black Sea extraction routes might be standing inside this room during a fleet emergency? The silence became even heavier. Several younger officers exchanged stunned looks while the lieutenant lowered his eyes toward the floor. Claire quietly folded one corner of the map again. The fleet still has time, she said evenly. But not much. The admiral nodded once and turned sharply toward the operations stations. The authority in his voice transformed the room instantly. Reroute Roosevelt Group 12 degrees west immediately. Pull outer patrols back 4 nautical miles and tighten formation spacing. Officers moved without hesitation now. Commands echoed across the room. Headsets snapped back on. Radar specialists updated coordinates at a frantic pace while communications officers relayed instructions through layers of static and storm interference. The lieutenant remained frozen beside the steel table for another second before finally speaking. "Sir, this is Commander Whitmore." The admiral looked directly at him. The same Commander Whitmore whose navigation algorithms are still taught at Annapolis. The young officer swallowed hard. Across the room, one of the older radar technicians slowly removed his glasses, staring at Claire with open disbelief. "I thought she retired years ago," he murmured quietly. Another officer shook his head. "No one retires after missions like hers." Claire ignored the conversation surrounding her. She stepped closer to the central radar display, studying the shifting fleet positions with complete focus. Her calmness contrasted sharply against the controlled chaos around her. The admiral moved beside her. "Can they still avoid the corridor?" he asked quietly enough that only nearby officers could hear. Claire studied the screen for 2 long seconds. "Yes," she replied. "But whoever is guiding those vessels knows we detected the pattern now." The older commander frowned. "Meaning?" Claire pointed toward a blinking contact near the edge of the storm front. "Meaning they are going to force a diversion." Almost immediately, another communications officer lifted his headset. "Sir, Roosevelt Actual reports unidentified movement changing course southbound." The room reacted instantly. Radar screens shifted. Officers began recalculating trajectories. Claire calmly picked up the black marker again and drew a new route line across the map with quick, precise movements. The lieutenant watched her silently now, the earlier arrogance completely gone from his face. "How are you doing this so fast?" he finally asked quietly. Claire never looked up from the map. "Because storms do not create chaos," she said softly. "People do." The admiral glanced toward her for a brief moment before giving a short nod, almost like someone acknowledging a truth they had learned years earlier. Then another transmission crackled through the speakers overhead. This time the voice sounded clearer. "Roosevelt Actual to command. Course correction successful. Unknown vessels adjusting away from intercept lane." A wave of relief spread visibly across the operations room. Several officers leaned back in their chairs for the first time all night. But Claire's expression remained unchanged. She stared at the radar screen for another second before speaking again in the same calm tone. This part was only the distraction. The relief inside the command center lasted less than 5 seconds. Officers had barely finished relaying the successful course correction when another radar alert flashed across the main display in sharp amber pulses. The atmosphere tightened instantly. Claire Whitmore remained motionless beside the operations table, her eyes fixed on the changing data while rain continued crashing against the harbor outside. The admiral looked toward the radar station. "Report." A young specialist leaned closer to his monitor, confusion spreading across his face. "Sir, we are tracking a second movement pattern." Several officers immediately turned back toward the central display. New signals had appeared farther south along the coastline, hidden beneath the edge of the storm system. Unlike the earlier vessels, these contacts were moving slowly. Deliberately. The older commander frowned. "That sector is nowhere near Roosevelt Group." Claire quietly shook her head once. "Exactly." The room fell silent again. The lieutenant stepped closer to the display, trying to process the shifting coordinates. "Then what are they targeting?" Claire looked toward the harbor through the rain-streaked windows. "Infrastructure," she replied softly. "Fuel routes. Communication relays. Harbor exits." The admiral's expression hardened immediately. "They used the fleet movement as bait," he said quietly. Claire nodded once. "To pull attention offshore." Around the room, officers began speaking rapidly again. New route projections appeared across multiple screens while communications teams redirected surveillance resources toward the coastline. One of the naval analysts looked visibly unsettled. "Sir, if those signals reach the lower harbor during this storm, visibility drops below safe tracking range." Claire calmly reached for the marker again and circled a narrow point near the southern edge of the harbor entrance. "They will bottleneck here first," she said. "It is the only approach protected from cross-current drift during heavy weather." The older commander stared at her. "You already knew that route too?" Claire did not answer directly. Instead, she folded part of the paper map inward, revealing another set of faded markings hidden beneath the top layer. Several nearby officers immediately leaned closer. The lieutenant's eyes widened slightly. "Those are military harbor schematics." Claire finally looked at him again. "Original emergency defense overlays," she corrected quietly. "Most were removed from digital archives years ago." The admiral studied the map carefully. "How do you still have access to these?" For the first time all night, Claire hesitated slightly before answering. "Because I wrote them." The silence that followed felt heavier than any alarm in the room. The lieutenant slowly looked from the map to Claire as if seeing her clearly for the first time. This was no longer just a respected strategist standing inside the command center. The realization spreading through the room was much bigger than that. Claire Whitmore had not simply participated in major naval operations. She had shaped them. Another transmission suddenly crackled overhead. "Harbor control to command. Southern surveillance drones are losing visual lock inside the storm front." Claire immediately stepped toward the main radar display. "Switch to thermal sweep layering," she said. "Primary radar will fail in this weather." One of the specialists hesitated. "We have not used layered thermal tracking in years." Claire picked up a nearby headset and adjusted one of the radar settings herself with quick, practiced movements. Within seconds, faint heat signatures began appearing beneath the storm interference. Several officers stared in disbelief as hidden vessel outlines slowly emerged across the display. The radar specialist blinked twice at his screen. "My God," he whispered. "There are 6 of them." The admiral looked toward Claire carefully now, almost studying her the way younger officers studied military legends during academy lectures. "How long have you been tracking this operation?" Claire removed the headset slowly and placed it back onto the console. Her voice remained calm, but there was something colder beneath it now. "Long enough to know this storm was never natural timing." Another flash of lightning illuminated the harbor outside while deep inside the command center, every officer in the room finally understood the same terrifying truth. Commander Claire Whitmore had walked into the base before the crisis even started because she already knew it was coming. The realization spread through the command center like a pressure wave. Officers who had dismissed Claire Whitmore less than an hour earlier now stared at her with a mixture of disbelief and unease. Rain continued slamming against the harbor outside while radar screens glowed across the dark room in shifting shades of blue and amber. Claire stood near the central console studying the thermal overlays with complete focus, seemingly untouched by the attention surrounding her. The admiral folded his arms behind his back and looked toward the operations staff. "Listen carefully," he said firmly. "Everything Commander Whitmore says from this point forward is to be treated as direct operational guidance." Nobody questioned the order. Not after the hidden vessels. Not after the harbor schematics. And definitely not after watching her uncover threats that their entire command center had failed to detect. The young lieutenant remained near the steel table, visibly unsettled. He glanced at Claire, then toward the admiral again. "Sir, if she knew this operation was coming, why was command never informed earlier?" Claire answered before the admiral could speak. "Because someone inside the system kept burying the signals." Several officers immediately looked up from their stations. The room became still again. Claire reached toward the map and tapped 2 locations near the southern harbor routes. 3 weeks ago, shipping records changed without authorization. Fuel movement schedules were adjusted twice. Coastal radar maintenance was delayed during storm season. The older commander frowned. "You tracked all of that yourself?" Claire nodded once. "Patterns matter more than reports." The admiral slowly looked around the room. Commander Whitmore has spent the last 8 years consulting on strategic threat prediction for operations most of you will never hear about, he said quietly. The reason her name disappeared from public military records is because her work became classified above fleet level. The lieutenant stared at Claire with growing disbelief. You are telling me she predicted this entire situation before tonight? Claire calmly folded part of the map inward again. Not the exact storm, she replied. Just the behavior around it. Another communications officer suddenly lifted his headset. Sir, Southern contacts are changing formation again. Claire immediately stepped toward the radar display. 6 vessel signatures had begun splitting into smaller movement clusters beneath the storm interference. The radar specialist shook his head nervously. I cannot tell which ones are real signals anymore. Claire narrowed her eyes slightly. That is intentional. She pointed toward 2 blinking contacts drifting farther west. Ignore those. They are decoys. The older commander looked stunned. How can you tell? Claire answered without hesitation. Too clean. Real vessels compensate against cross-current pressure during storms. Those patterns are computer stabilized. Within seconds, the radar specialist confirmed it. She is right. The westbound signals are artificial reflections. A quiet wave of disbelief moved through the room again. One younger officer whispered under his breath, how does someone even notice that? The admiral looked toward Claire for a moment before answering instead. Because she spent 15 years studying how people hide things. Claire ignored the comment entirely. Her attention remained fixed on the radar. Another set of coordinates flashed near the lower harbor. This time her expression changed slightly for the first time all night. Not fear. Concern. There, she said quietly. That is the real approach. The command center immediately shifted focus toward the new signal cluster. Officers updated route projections while communications teams relayed fresh orders to harbor patrol units. The lieutenant stepped closer to Claire carefully now, his earlier arrogance completely gone. Commander Whitmore, he said hesitantly. Why come here yourself? Why not send a report through command channels? Claire finally looked at him directly. Her voice stayed calm, but there was something heavy behind it now. Because reports can be ignored, she said softly. Consequences cannot. Thunder rolled across the harbor again while every officer in the room worked under her direction. Less than an hour earlier, most of them saw Claire Whitmore as an unwanted civilian standing in the wrong room. Now the entire naval operation was moving according to her instructions. The command center moved with sharp precision now, every officer focused on the shifting radar pattern spreading across the harbor display. Rain continued crashing against the reinforced windows while thunder rolled low across the Atlantic outside. Claire Whitmore stood near the central operations console with the folded paper map resting beneath one hand, her attention fixed on the lower harbor routes. The atmosphere inside the room had changed completely. Nobody questioned her anymore. Every update, every command, every adjustment flowed through her position at the center of the room. The admiral watched quietly as officers redirected patrol craft toward the southern approach lanes. Thermal overlays stabilized, one radar specialist reported. Harbor exits are now fully visible. Claire studied the screen for another second before pointing toward a narrow opening between 2 shipping channels. Move Patrol Group 3 here, she said calmly. Keep them outside visual range until the contacts commit. The older commander immediately relayed the order. Around the room, younger officers moved quickly without hesitation. The same people who dismissed Claire as an unwanted civilian less than an hour earlier were now watching her every movement like students inside a classroom. The young lieutenant stood silently near the back operations table, still visibly shaken by everything he had learned. His eyes drifted toward the weathered paper map again. Commander Whitmore, he asked quietly, how long have you been carrying that map? Claire glanced down briefly at the folded edges softened by years of use. Since before most digital systems replaced field navigation, she replied. The lieutenant frowned slightly. You still trust paper over satellites? Claire gave the faintest hint of a smile. Paper does not crash during storms. A few nearby officers exchanged small glances, and for the first time all night, tension inside the room eased slightly. Another communications officer suddenly lifted one hand toward his headset. Sir, Southern contacts are slowing. Claire's expression sharpened instantly. She stepped closer to the radar display. The 6 vessel signatures had reduced speed near the harbor entrance, hovering just beyond visual range inside the storm front. They know we repositioned patrols, the older commander said quietly. Claire nodded once. Because someone warned them. The room immediately went silent again. Several officers looked around instinctively, uneasy at the implication hanging in the air. The admiral folded his arms behind his back. Internal leak. Claire kept her eyes on the radar. Most likely. The lieutenant looked unsettled again. You think someone inside the base is feeding movement data out during the operation? Claire did not answer immediately. Then she pointed toward one blinking signal near the harbor edge. That vessel adjusted course 30 seconds after our patrol moved, she said. That timing is impossible without live communication. The realization spread visibly across the room. One of the younger analysts swallowed hard and lowered his eyes toward his console. The admiral's expression hardened. Lock down external transmissions from this facility immediately. Officers moved at once. Security protocols activated across multiple systems while communications channels narrowed to encrypted military frequencies only. Claire quietly stepped away from the radar display and folded the paper map carefully closed. The lieutenant watched her for a moment before finally speaking again. Earlier tonight, he said slowly, when you first walked in here. I thought you were lost. Claire looked toward him calmly. Most people only notice uniforms, she replied. The young officer lowered his eyes, embarrassed now by his earlier behavior. I should not have spoken to you the way I did. Claire studied him for a second, then shook her head slightly. You reacted to appearance, she said evenly. That is common. The lieutenant looked surprised by the absence of anger in her voice. Across the room, another radar alert suddenly flashed across the harbor display. One of the specialists immediately looked up. Sir, the unidentified vessels are retreating. Several officers stared at the screen in disbelief as the signal slowly turned away from the harbor approach lanes. The storm operation was collapsing. The admiral exhaled quietly for the first time all night. But Claire's eyes remained fixed on the disappearing signals. Her expression stayed unreadable as thunder rolled once more across the harbor outside. No, she said softly. They are not retreating. The room froze again. Claire slowly looked toward the dark rain-covered windows facing the naval base. They already got what they came for. The command center remained frozen after Claire Whitmore spoke. Rain rolled across the harbor windows in thick waves while the retreating vessel signals slowly faded from the radar display. Several officers looked at one another in confusion. The older commander stepped closer to Claire. What do you mean they already got what they came for? Claire rested the folded paper map against the steel table and looked toward the main operations screen. Attention, she said quietly. Movement. Fear. Reaction patterns. The admiral narrowed his eyes slightly. This entire operation was reconnaissance. Claire nodded once. They forced the fleet to expose response timing, patrol procedures, radar limitations, and harbor coordination speed during severe weather. The room fell silent again as the realization spread across every face. One of the younger analysts slowly leaned back in his chair. They were studying us. Yes, Claire answered calmly. And they learned a great deal tonight. The lieutenant looked visibly frustrated with himself now. If Commander Whitmore had not arrived, he stopped speaking before finishing the sentence. Nobody in the room needed to hear the rest. They already understood it. Without her intervention, the fleet would have walked directly into the distraction while the harbor remained exposed and blind beneath the storm. Another communications officer adjusted his headset. "Sir, all unidentified contacts are now leaving territorial range." The admiral nodded once. "Maintain thermal tracking until they disappear completely." Around the room, officers slowly began returning to normal operations. The alarms had stopped. The flashing warning lights dimmed back to standard command lighting. But the atmosphere inside the operations center no longer felt the same. Earlier that night, most people inside the room had seen Claire Whitmore as an interruption. A civilian woman carrying an outdated paper map into a restricted military command center during a crisis. Now every officer present understood they had been standing beside one of the most respected strategic minds the Navy had ever produced without even recognizing her. The lieutenant stepped toward Claire carefully. His posture was completely different now. Respectful. Controlled. "Commander Whitmore," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Claire looked toward him calmly. "For what?" The young officer lowered his eyes briefly. "For assuming you did not belong here." Claire studied him for a moment while thunder rolled faintly in the distance outside. Then she folded the weathered map one final time and slipped it beneath her arm. "People make fast judgments under pressure," she said evenly. "What matters is whether they learn from them." The older commander gave a small nod at those words. Around the room, several officers quietly returned to work, though more than a few still glanced toward Claire with open admiration. The admiral walked beside her toward the command center exit. "Washington will want a full briefing by morning," he said. Claire gave a faint nod. "They usually do." The admiral stopped near the blast doors and looked back toward the operations room. "You know," he said quietly, "half the officers in here grew up hearing stories about the Black Sea extraction." Claire's expression remained unreadable. Stories tend to improve with age. For the first time all night, the admiral allowed himself a slight smile. Behind them, the young lieutenant suddenly called out, "Commander." Claire paused near the doorway and looked back. The officer straightened instinctively before speaking. "How did you know the storm was the perfect cover for the operation?" Claire glanced once toward the dark harbor beyond the reinforced glass. Her voice stayed calm and measured, the same way it had all night. "Because professionals do not hide inside chaos," she said softly. "They create it." Then she stepped through the blast doors and disappeared down the dim steel hallway while the sound of rain echoed faintly through the naval base. Inside the command center, nobody spoke for several long seconds. Finally, the older commander looked toward the young lieutenant standing beside the steel table where Claire's map had rested earlier. "Remember tonight," he said quietly. "The military teaches rank. Experience teaches recognition." Outside, the storm slowly drifted farther out across the Atlantic while deep inside the harbor command center, the officers who witnessed the operation would remember one lesson long after the radar screens went dark. Respect was never attached to appearance. It was earned through calmness, competence, and the ability to see what everyone else missed.